kind of a long process, I thought, but it was good because I actually helped a lot more.
I look for a good presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you. All right, you want to begin? Yeah, okay. Well, so welcome our small group. Thank you for making it here today. Dr. Daniel Armani will be speaking to us today about, you changed the title a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So he's currently a visiting assistant professor in the Lerner College of Business, and he is an institutional economist and data scientist working on automated governance, collective intelligence, blockchain technology, smart contracts, and decentralized organizations. He has designed and experimented with different collective intelligence protocols at the University of Texas, Austin as the principal investigator, and at the Michigan State University as the researcher. He is the designer and chief scaffolder of Paperstore, the first decentralized academic journal. He is also the CEO of Teammate Me, a global team building platform. He has a PhD in business information systems at Michigan State University, and let's welcome Dr. Armani.
So, let's start with some background. So, first of all, I'm sorry that I changed the title a little bit. So, that's a minor modification. So, this is a big question. Why some nations fail and some nations prosper? So, there have been several studies on trying to answer this question, but here I'm trying to provide a new perspective. So, you probably have heard of this famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jack Diamond. So he argued that it's all about geographic locations and access to resources. But his theory has too many exceptions. For example, when we see Afghanistan, so it is landlocked. So that's an example that they provide. And of course it is a poor country, but Switzerland also is landlocked, and it is not a poor country. Another example would be Japan. Japan does not have many resources. It doesn't have oil, gas, nothing much. So it is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. So there have been other studies as well. This is my favorite book, Why Nations Fail, by Diana McLaughlin and James Robinson. So they argued that it is all about institutions, and inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. So just to paraphrase what they say, it is all about the constitution that governs the country. So they provide very good arguments about what countries are successful and what countries are not, and they show a good correlation between the inclusivity of the institutions and the prosperity of a nation. However, they still have some exceptions. A very important exception would be China versus India. So India has many inclusive institutions. It is democratic, and it is not one of the wealthiest nations in the world yet. On the other hand, China is oligarchic, and it is making progress very fast. So why? So here I'm trying to break down the reasons and the mechanisms behind this cause and effect, or this cause and effect hypothesis. There are many other books on the topic, but here I'm going to try to develop my theory using evolution. So we start with evolution as like many other sciences, many other studies, as it is required by law or something. So what we see is that we see there are many tribes competing against each other in the history, and so at some point we can consider them societies, so we can call them tribes, societies, nations, whatever. And there are some factors that lead to the success of the tribe, and some factors that lead to the failure of the tribe. So some factors help the tribes to prosper, to succeed, to thrive. So some of the factors are pretty obvious, like genes. So people, stronger people are more likely to survive. So tribes with stronger and smarter people are more likely to survive, right? But there are other genes as well. So we should remember that it is the genes that we have are selfish genes. So it is not selfish individuals, it's selfish genes. So for example, conscience or patriotism or a sense of teamwork or love of family. So these are some genes that we have, these are in our genes, and they do not help us much with individual survival. Sometimes they have just the opposite effect. So if I'm willing to die for my country, so of course it is not gonna improve my chances of survival, right? But it improves the chances of the survival of the country, of the nation, of the society, and of the genes, of those genes. So the genes that lead to this sense of patriotism, okay? So that's why we are hardwired to want the success of our nation, our tribe, and our society, even at the cost of, at the expense of our own, failure. So these are biological genes, but other than that, we have other genes that are not biological. So, I mean, other factors that are not biological, and I call them societal genes. For example, social values. So different societies have different social values, and societies with better social values have a higher chance of survival. Institutions. Societies with better institutions have a higher chance of survival. So again, these are selfish genes. So for example, we have religious institutions, and religious institutions seek survival of those religions, not the society, So again, they just try to maximize their own chances of survival. So not the society's chance of survival. And also you have knowledge and technology. The most important of which would be contracts. So in my opinion, contracts are the most important inventions that we have had. So let's start with institutions and social values. So by institutions, I mean just the law enforcement institutions, courts, things like that, army. And it is interesting that in almost every country, we see there is a police force, there are courts, there is an army. Apparently, these are necessary genes for the society. The societies without those genes have not survived. The societies without police force, without courts, have not survived. So we see the societies with these institutions nowadays. And also we have social values, so like justice, property rights, the right to liberty, life, etc. And it is interesting that we have these values almost in every society. So one of the recently developed values is democracy. So democracy is also a value now because it leads to the survival of the society, it leads to the prosperity of the society. So it has become value. And, so generally, why do we care about justice? Because it leads to prosperity. And the question is how? How does it lead to prosperity? And why do we have natural rights? Because they lead to prosperity. So, yeah, that's about it. So, thank you. Any question? Just kidding. Well played. Let's start with important inventions in human history. So, as I mentioned, the inventions that I focus on are contracts. So what are the contracts? What are contracts? They are promises that become credible. Okay? So there are two types of contracts: social contracts and voluntary contracts. So social contracts are the contracts that are imposed on everybody, no matter you consent or not. So it is imposed on everybody. It is not voluntary. And so norms, social norms, laws, they are social contracts. Voluntary contracts are based on unanimous consent. So every participant in a voluntary contract gives consent and agrees to the contract. That means every participant should be better off with that contract. That means the contract results in a Pareto superior result, a Pareto superior outcome. Every voluntary contract results in a Pareto superior outcome, assuming that people are selfish. Okay? So these are two types of contracts that we have, and we see the outcomes of these contracts and why they became important for the societies. So the first social contract, probably the most important invention in human history, is property rights. And we see that property rights would lead to investment and creation. So when I have the right to a property, of course I take care of it. And there are some places that they don't have property rights. For example, there is a tribe in northern Tanzania that they don't have the word have or ownership. So having doesn't mean anything. So they don't have properties, land or anything, and so as a result, expectedly, nobody builds a house or a building or a factory or anything there. So yeah, but you may think, okay, that's probably because of some other things, that's probably because of some other factors like, I don't know, the access to resources, location, religion that they have, the, like the DNA, you know, the race, whatever. But there are other examples too. So we see two countries in this picture. Guess which one has property rights and which one doesn't?
South Korea.
Yeah. So South Korea and North Korea. So it's pretty obvious that property rights is important. So now, so the other invention would be voluntary contracts or transactions. So transactions would mean just exchanging property rights. So we define property rights and then we define the transfer of property rights, the exchange of property rights. Okay? That leads to markets and economies of scale and specialization. So when we have transactions, that means you don't need to produce everything for yourself. You can specialize on producing something and you exchange with others. So specialization and economies of scale. The other social contract would be money. So a fungible asset or a fungible property. So a standardized property. That leads to price, the concept of price. And that leads to liquidity and better markets, so competition in the markets. So more competition, more liquidity in the markets. The next one would be fungible assets. So standardizing other assets other than money, like metals, like you know, precious metals and things like that. So that leads to homogeneous markets and equilibrium prices. So we have equilibrium prices for gold, for oil, you know, we have equilibrium prices. And then we have FAIRs, another type of voluntary contracts. So more than two people can agree on something, and again, everybody gives consent to that contract. So firms lead to capital markets. So some people can invest, some people work, some people can do something, some people can do other things. So more specialization, more economies of scale, better investments. And a very important social contract is constitution. So constitution leads to government and less risk and more investment. Lower risk and more investment. But are these promises credible? So we are talking about promises. How do we make them credible? So for example, transaction. You say, okay, this is $20. So you give me $20, I give it to you. Then you give me $20 and then I don't give it to you. What happens? So for every one of these contracts, for all contracts, we need some sort of enforcement. So the big elephant in the room is about enforcement. How do we enforce the contracts? Contracts need enforcement to become credible. So they are just empty promises unless we have enforcement mechanisms. So what's enforcement? So enforcement is essentially cost on violation. That's it. That's how I define enforcement. So the cost can be ex-ante cost, like information and physics. So let's say you have a password for your Bitcoin wallet. So it is going to be very costly to, decrypt that password, the private key. So you have a private key, so it is very difficult to find the private key. Or you have a code for the door. It is very difficult to crack that code. So that's obvious, but that is not enough. So in many cases, for example, let's say I have a house and I want to protect my house, my property to the house. So if, for example, the house, it has just a code in front of the door has a code, it is worth it for many people to spend money and crack that code and then enter the house and occupy the house, because the house is worth much more, right? So we need other mechanisms as well. The other mechanisms are ex post costs. So there's a penalty for violating this rule or this contract. So essentially, we need credible threats. So to make the promises credible, we need credible threats most of the time. So threats can be credible through several methods. One way is through social reciprocity. So oldest credible threat, the oldest ex post cost. So the other one is through belief systems. So we have developed some belief systems like karma, that, okay, so if you do good things happen to you. If you do bad things happen to you. So, and all of these are for enforcing contracts. Remember, we are talking about enforcing contracts, and these are the mechanisms that we use for that. Religions are developed and evolved to enforce contracts. So afterlife, whatever. So ex post costs that we have for enforcing our property rights. So stealing is a sin, for example. So reputation systems, they impose ex post costs. So when people violate a contract, let's say they don't keep their promises, like a transaction or something, of course the information can be propagated and other people can know about it. So, but these are not enough. These are not enough for enforcing big contracts, more serious contracts like firms. So how can we deal with them? Institutions. So institutions are other mechanisms to enforce contracts, and they enforce contracts through other contracts. So institutions are actually about contracts themselves. So we use some contracts to enforce some other contracts. For example, so we have police force. So the police officers enforce property rights. And why do they do that? Because they are paid to do that. So they have contracts, they have voluntary contracts, they pay them to do that. but those contracts should be enforced too. How do we enforce those contracts? Through other contracts. Like there is a court system, the judges, they are paid, they have incentives to enforce other contracts. So the incentives are provided through other contracts. So this is a never-ending cycle, you know, because you need a contract to enforce another contract, and you need another contract to enforce that contract. So at the end, we need a contract that can enforce itself. There is no way around it. We need a contract that can enforce itself. So we call that contract a protocol. So protocols are self-enforcing rules. So, and of course, enforcing the self-enforcement is through Nash equilibrium. So the equilibrium that they make, the second perfect Nash equilibrium that they make, actually enforces the contract. So essentially, what is enforced is the equilibrium. So it is self-enforcing. So languages are examples of protocols. FTP, HTTP, of course, the languages for the computers to talk with each other. Autocracy is a kind of protocol actually, because you have a king or an autocrat or a monarch, and they distribute the resources. They distribute the resources in a way that to the people that actually are more loyal to them, and therefore people have incentives to be loyal to the king, and so it is a circle, you know. So it is a self-enforcing system. So you know, so they essentially what they do is that they take taxes from people and give the taxes, a simplified case, give the taxes to the military or to the armed forces, and pay the armed forces to take taxes from the people, you know, so something like that. Democracy also is a protocol because it is self-enforcing. So if we have democracy, when we have democracy, because the different institutions actually control each other, but it is a complex protocol. It is a complex, we're going to talk about it. Generally, constitutions are protocols. Constitutions are simply protocols. They are self-enforcing contracts. And they are protocols that can enforce other contracts too. They are particular types of protocols that not only enforce themselves, but also enforce other contracts. Blockchain protocols are also protocols, obviously. And it is interesting that blockchain protocols are very similar to constitutions. So a blockchain protocol is actually a constitution. It's a constitution in computer code. Except its jurisdiction is not geographic, its jurisdiction is based on functionality, right? And it can enforce other contracts too. So some blockchain protocols can enforce other contracts too, like Ethereum can enforce smart contracts. So if you give the contract in computer code, it can enforce it. So, and also there are, so you may think that, okay, it is not an incomplete contract, they can just enforce complete contracts, like, you know, smart contracts that are in computer code. But it is not the case. Actually, there are new DAOs or new smart contracts that can enforce incomplete contracts too, like Kleros. Kleros is a new smart contract that is on top of the Ethereum blockchain and can enforce the incomplete contracts too. So it is an arbitration mechanism. So they have a kind of judicial system. So essentially what is happening is that the blockchain protocols, since they are much more efficient than the old traditional constitutions, they're taking away the functionalities and tasks of the constitutions, and they're doing the better and better, one after another. And someone may say, okay, how can a blockchain enforce property rights or contracts in the physical world? How is it possible? It's very simple. How can a constitution enforce the property rights? They pay police force, courts, etc. to enforce in the physical world, right? So the blockchain can do that too. So the blockchain can have smart contracts, voluntary smart contracts with some agents, let's say police force, and pay them and enforce property rights, enforce contracts in the real world. So they can perform all the functionalities of the constitutions. And one of the
Yeah, I guess, sorry to interrupt you on this. What about credibility of those agents though? In terms of, you said that they can hire agents, but are they credible agents? What happens if different, people hire different types of agents? And then, so doesn't that result in like potentially an arms race of hiring different agents to cheat one another in that situation, since, as you said, they can hire almost like anyone, right? Like you could hire a private security firm to go and enforce some sort of dispute in the physical world.
You're talking about conflict of jurisdiction.
Right.
Conflict of jurisdiction, right?
To some degree, yeah.
Yeah. So what do we do with that now? How do we handle this now? So just with traditional constitutions.
Well, the Constitution lays out who has jurisdiction
Yeah.
and recognizes official sources of enforcing those jurisdictions.
And people are vetted, so people are
Yes.
selected carefully, and so we have an information system. It's all about information.
But it's within that geographic area,
Yeah.
or like in this case, the United States, or a state or county. But if we have these e-constitutions that would cross borders and is borderless essentially.
Which constitution will be effective? Right? Is that the question? So
Yeah, I would
so
say,
when we have multiple
when it comes to
constitutions.
enforcement,
Yeah, so currently we have boundaries based on geographical territories,
yes.
right? And that's because, so what happens is that we have a monopoly, essentially kind of monopoly of violence
Yes.
for the presiding government. And that's because, obviously, when there is a challenge to the government, of course, whoever has power can just eradicate the other party. So challenging power is very costly. It's very costly. And whoever wins kills the others, right? Kills the second and the third one. Okay, so it is like a race that in which the winner kills the runner-off. So you don't want to be in this race most of the time, right? So essentially, at the end of the day, in equilibrium, there will be one power. There will be one source of one jurisdiction. So, or there will be fight, there will be a revolution, something like that. Okay? So we will end up with one source of power. Okay? Because at the end, we need actually one decision. So I'm going to actually talk about it in a bit. So, yeah, so essentially I'm arguing that blockchain protocols will overtake the constitutions in the world. And I'm going to make a very bold prediction. So, if let's say in 20 years ago, someone told you that we will have something this size, you will have something this size in your pocket, and you will have access to all the information in the world, all the knowledge and information in the world for free in the fraction of a second, you would say, okay, it's ridiculous. It's not gonna happen, right? So now, probably, there are things that we cannot imagine and will happen in 20 years, okay? So there is something that I want to predict, and that is, I think in 50 years, at most in 50 years, most of the countries in the world will be united. So, and this can happen in several ways. So one way is that blockchains will govern the world. So the governments will go away, will fade away. So there will be no United States government. In 50 years, there will be no United States government. That's my prediction. So this can happen through blockchains. Hopefully, this is the good scenario. But this can also happen through artificial intelligence. So if any person, any institution, any country in the world achieves singularity, their technology, their military technology, advances very quickly, exponentially. And for example, in 6 months, they advance 100,000 years. So their technology is so advanced that they can easily dominate all the other nations. For example, if Putin, if Russia achieves singularity,